The year is 858. Kyoto, the Heian Imperial Palace. A young woman walks through a corridor of polished cypress. She has just turned 18. Her feet make no sound. She has been trained to move like water. Behind her, two older women follow. They carry silk robes folded across their arms like offerings to a god. The young woman does not look back. She knows better. Somewhere ahead, past the paper screens and the incense smoke, a man waits. He has never seen her face. She has never spoken his name aloud. To do so would be a crime. Tonight, she will enter a room lit by a single oil lamp. She will kneel on tatami mats that cost more than her father's farm, and she will wait. She will wait for hours, sometimes until dawn. If she is summoned, she will move forward on her knees, eyes down, hands pressed to the floor. If she is not summoned, she will retreat the same way. Out of the room, into the corridor, back to the chamber where 40 other women sleep on thin futons, listening to each other breathe. This is not a love story. This is not a fairy tale about an emperor who fell for a commoner. This is a machine. And tonight, this woman becomes a part in that machine. Her name will never be recorded. Her face will never be painted. Her children, if she has any, will be taken from her the moment they can walk. One concrete detail you need to remember. She was given a number, not a title, not a rank. A number. Court Woman 47. That number was written on a wooden tag. That tag was hung outside her sleeping chamber. And every night for the rest of her life in that palace, that number determined whether she lived in warmth or in cold, whether she ate fresh rice or scraps, whether she was remembered or forgotten. This is not fiction. This happened. This is the story of the Imperial Consort system of Japan. A system that lasted more than 1,000 years. A system that processed thousands of women through the most powerful chambers in Asia. And a system that was deliberately, methodically erased from the official record. Here is the thesis. This was not passion. This was protocol. Every encounter was documented. Every pregnancy was monitored. Every woman was disposable. And when the system ended, not with a revolution, but with a quiet administrative memo in the 20th century, the architects of that system made sure you would never know it existed. If this story grips you, drop a like and subscribe. Here we unearth the chapters history tried to bury. But before you understand what happened inside those palace walls, you need to understand how a woman became a number in the first place. The selection process began in villages. It began with census records. It began with local officials who understood exactly what the court wanted: youth, health, beauty, silence. Those were the 4 criteria. They were never written down, but everyone knew them. Families did not resist. They could not. When an imperial envoy arrived in a village, he did not ask permission. He did not negotiate. He pointed, and the family bowed. Think about that. Your daughter, your sister, gone with a gesture. In exchange, the family received a small payment, sometimes rice, sometimes cloth, sometimes nothing at all except the honor of having contributed to the imperial bloodline. The woman was taken to Kyoto. She was bathed, she was dressed, she was trained. The training lasted months, sometimes years. She learned how to walk without sound. She learned how to pour tea without spilling. She learned how to arrange flowers in patterns that pleased the emperor's eye. She learned how to be invisible until she was wanted. And visible only in the exact ways she was wanted. The women who trained her were former court women themselves. Women who had aged out of favor. Women who had failed to produce sons. They were ruthless. They had to be. Because in this system, failure was not just personal. Failure was contagious. If an imperial consort embarrassed the emperor, her entire training cohort could be dismissed. Her teachers could be exiled. Her family could lose their land. So the teachers removed the softness from these women. They removed the individuality. They removed the names. By the time a woman was presented to the emperor, she was not a person. She was a vessel. A vessel for imperial legacy. A vessel for imperial use. A vessel that could be filled or emptied at will. The Engishiki, a legal code completed in 927, contains fragments of the regulations governing this system. It describes the hierarchy. It describes the rituals. It describes the punishments. A court woman who spoke out of turn could be beaten. A court woman who showed jealousy could be exiled. A court woman who failed to conceive within 3 years could be returned to her family in disgrace. Read that again. Returned. Like a defective product. And here is what the code does not describe. The emotional reality. The psychological destruction. The slow erasure of self that happened inside those beautiful rooms. For that, we have to look elsewhere. We have to read between the lines of poetry. We have to decode the diaries that survived only by accident. One such diary belonged to a woman known only as the Kagero Lady. She was not an imperial consort. She was the secondary wife of a powerful noble. But her words capture something universal about women in this system. She wrote of waiting. Endless waiting. She wrote of hearing footsteps approach her chamber then pass by. Night after night. She wrote of relief. And she wrote of shame at feeling that relief. This was not brutality. This was protocol. And the protocol demanded something more insidious than violence. It demanded gratitude. A court woman was expected to be grateful for her position. She had been lifted from poverty into the palace. She slept on silk. She ate from porcelain. What right did she have to suffer? This psychological trap was intentional. It made resistance almost impossible. Because how do you rebel against privilege? How do you escape a cage made of gold? The answer, for most of these women, was simple. You do not escape. You endure. You endure until your beauty fades. You endure until a younger woman arrives. You endure until you are quietly moved to a smaller chamber, then a smaller one, then a room near the kitchens where no one visits. And then you endure the final indignity. You are forgotten while still alive. But some women did not endure quietly. Some women found ways to resist, to manipulate, to survive. And their methods will disturb you far more than the system itself. The palace was not one building. It was a city within a city. The Heian imperial compound covered more than 100 acres. It contained gardens, shrines, administrative offices, and residential quarters for thousands of people. And at its center, like a spider in a web, sat the dairy, the emperor's private residence. Only a handful of people could enter the dairy without invitation. And for a court woman, invitation was everything. The geography mattered. Where you slept determined who you were. The highest-ranking imperial consorts lived in the Kokiden and Fujitsubo pavilions. These were structures adjacent to the emperor's own chambers. A summons could reach them in minutes. Lower-ranking court women lived further away. Some in buildings that required a walk through open courtyards. In winter, that walk could take 15 minutes in the cold. By the time a low-ranking court woman reached the emperor's chamber, her hands were numb. Her makeup was ruined. Her silk robes were damp. She arrived already diminished, already apologizing. This was not accident. This was architecture as hierarchy. The women understood this. They understood that every detail of their environment was designed to remind them of their place. The food was another marker. High-ranking consorts received fresh fish, seasonal vegetables, and sweets from the imperial kitchen. Low-ranking court women received rice and pickled radish, sometimes meat that had turned. If a low-ranking court woman complained, she was reminded of her origins. She was reminded that peasants did not complain about food. She was reminded that gratitude was her only appropriate emotion. This was not chaos. This was a system, and the system had one purpose: to produce heirs. Everything else was secondary. The beauty, the poetry, the elaborate rituals, all of it existed to serve one biological function. The emperor needed sons, the empire needed continuity, and court women were the means of production. Think about that phrase, means of production. These women were not partners. They were not even servants. They were raw material. Their bodies were inventoried. Their cycles were tracked by palace physicians. Their fertility was a matter of state concern. The Naishi no Tsukasa, the Bureau of Palace Attendants, maintained records of every court woman's monthly cycle. These records were reviewed by senior officials. If a woman's cycle was irregular, she was examined. If she was ill, she was treated. If she was barren, she was replaced. The efficiency was remarkable. The cruelty was unremarkable. It was simply how things were done. And if a court woman did conceive, her ordeal was only beginning. Pregnancy brought scrutiny. Constant, invasive scrutiny. The palace physicians visited daily. They checked her pulse. They examined her condition. They prescribed herbs and diets designed to produce a male child. The preference for sons was absolute. A daughter was a disappointment. A son was a triumph. And the court woman who produced a son was elevated. Temporarily. She received better quarters, better food, better treatment. But she did not receive her child. The child was taken immediately after birth and given to wet nurses chosen by the court. The court woman might see her son once a month, sometimes less. She was not allowed to nurse him. She was not allowed to hold him for too long. She was not allowed to form what the court called excessive attachment, because excessive attachment was dangerous. Excessive attachment meant an imperial consort might prioritize her child over the emperor. She might scheme for her son's advancement. She might become a political actor. And political actors were threats. The court had seen what ambitious mothers could do. History was full of empresses and consorts who had manipulated their sons into power, who had eliminated rivals, who had destabilized dynasties. So the system preemptively separated mother and child. It made maternal love a controlled substance. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was prevention. Read that again. They called it prevention. The Fujiwara clan perfected this system. They were the regents who controlled the imperial court for centuries. They supplied emperors with consorts from their own family. And they understood something profound about power. Control the mothers, and you control the sons. A Fujiwara daughter who became empress had resources. She had family. She had allies. A peasant court woman who became pregnant had nothing. Her son might inherit the throne, but she would inherit nothing. She would remain what she had always been, a vessel. The tale of Genji, written around the year 1000 by a court lady named Murasaki Shikibu, captures this reality in fiction. The novel's protagonist, Prince Genji, is the son of an emperor and a low-ranking consort. His mother is beautiful and beloved, but she has no family, no protectors. The other court ladies torment her. They block her path in corridors. They mock her provincial origins. They leave refuse outside her door. She dies young. The official cause is illness. But Murasaki suggests something else. She suggests this woman was destroyed by cruelty. Slow, deliberate, unpunishable cruelty. This is a novel. But novels reflect their times. And the time of the tale of Genji was a time when a court woman without connections was prey. The violence was rarely physical. It did not need to be. A well-placed rumor could destroy a woman's reputation. A whispered accusation of disloyalty could lead to exile or worse. And the accusers faced no consequences. Because who would believe a court woman over a noblewoman? Who would investigate the word of a peasant's daughter? The hierarchy protected itself. The system sustained itself. And the women at the bottom learned to survive by becoming invisible, by never complaining, by never wanting, by shrinking themselves into the smallest possible space. Some found other strategies. Some found ways to accumulate power despite everything. Lady Nijo is one example. She served in the court of Emperor Go-Fukakusa in the 13th century. She entered service at 18. She was passed between the emperor and several powerful nobles. Her body was not her own, but she was literate, and she was observant. She kept a diary. In that diary, she recorded everything: the politics, the betrayals, the petty humiliations. She recorded how the emperor discarded women when they aged. She recorded how nobles traded court women like property. And she recorded her own feelings, her rage, her grief, her disgust. This diary survived. Barely. It was discovered centuries later in a temple archive. Scholars believe Lady Nijo hid it there herself after she became a Buddhist nun. She knew what she had written was dangerous. She knew it could not be published in her lifetime. But she wanted someone to know. She wanted the truth to exist somewhere, even if no one read it. That impulse matters. That act of witness matters. Because for every Lady Nijo who wrote, there were thousands who did not. Thousands whose stories died with them. This was not war. This was industry. An industry of silence. An industry of forgetting. And the industry was so efficient that modern historians struggle to reconstruct even basic facts about these women's lives. We do not know how many court women served in the imperial palace. Estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. We do not know how many children they bore. We do not know how many died in childbirth, from illness, from neglect. We do not know their names. But we know they existed. We know they suffered. And we know someone decided their suffering did not deserve to be remembered. That decision was not passive. That decision was deliberate. And the next phase of the story reveals exactly who made that decision and why. The Meiji Restoration changed everything, and it changed nothing. In 1868, a coalition of samurai overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate. They restored the emperor to power. They began the transformation of Japan into a modern nation-state. The emperor at the center of this restoration was Mutsuhito. He was a young man. He had grown up in the old palace system. He knew the court women. He had been raised by them. But the men around him had a vision of Japan as a Western power, a vision of Japan as a constitutional monarchy with a dignified, respectable emperor at its head. And imperial consorts did not fit that vision. The Western powers that Japan sought to impress had eliminated their own royal consort systems. Queen Victoria of Britain was the model of modern monarchy. She was devoted to her husband. She was publicly moral. Japan needed its own Victoria. Japan needed Empress Haruko. The new government began a systematic campaign of image management. The emperor would have one wife, one empress, one respectable household. But here is what the history books rarely mention. The campaign was a lie. Emperor Meiji continued to have court women. He had at least 5 official consorts who bore him children. Of his 15 children, only 5 were born to Empress Haruko. The rest were born to imperial consorts. The consorts lived in a separate residence. They were not photographed. They were not mentioned in official proclamations. Their children were legally registered as the empress's children, not as the children of their biological mothers. Think about that. Your child, taken from you, given another mother's name, and you are expected to be grateful, because your child is now officially royal. This was not abolition of the consort system. This was rebranding. The system continued. It simply became invisible. The women were no longer called imperial consorts. They were called naishi, a neutral term meaning inner attendant. The records were no longer kept in public archives. They were moved to the Imperial Household Agency, a closed institution that remains secretive to this day. And the Japanese public was told a story about a modern emperor with a modern family, a story about progress and Western values. This story was repeated in newspapers. It was taught in schools. It was believed. And the women who knew the truth were silenced. Not through violence, through shame. To reveal the existence of court women was to embarrass the emperor. To embarrass the emperor was to betray the nation. So the naishi said nothing. Their families said nothing. The servants who witnessed everything said nothing. The silence was total. And when the women died, their graves were unmarked. Their names were removed from temple records. Their descendants were given new family histories that erased any connection to the palace. This was not an accident. This was policy. The Imperial Household Agency possessed, and still possesses, vast archives. These archives contain birth records, death records, financial records, correspondence. Scholars have requested access for decades. They have been refused. The justification is privacy. The justification is dignity. The justification is tradition. But the effect is erasure. Complete, systematic erasure. We know Emperor Meiji had consorts only because foreign diplomats mentioned them in their dispatches. Because journalists published rumors that the government could not fully suppress. We know the system continued under Emperor Taisho because of a single photograph that was never supposed to become public. The photograph shows a woman holding an infant. The woman is not Empress Teimei. The infant would later become Emperor Hirohito. One photograph. One crack in the official story. And that crack is all we have. This was not brutality. This was protocol. The protocol of respectability. The protocol of silence. The protocol of making inconvenient women disappear from history. Emperor Hirohito, who reigned from 1926 to 1989, was the first emperor to officially have no consorts. His wife, Empress Kojun, bore him 7 children, all officially, all publicly acknowledged. Historians debate whether this was conviction or calculation, whether Hirohito genuinely believed in monogamy, or simply understood that modern emperors could not afford scandals. What we know is that his decision ended a system that had lasted more than 1,000 years. One man, one choice, and the consort system ended. Not with protests, not with reforms, with a memo, a quiet administrative decision that this practice would no longer continue. And that decision came with another decision. The decision that this practice had never really existed at all. The Imperial Household Agency intensified its restrictions on archival access. The government declined to acknowledge the historical existence of imperial consorts in official statements. Japanese textbooks do not mention them. Japanese museums do not display artifacts related to them. The Heian court is presented as a world of poetry and art. The tale of Genji is taught as literature, not as documentary evidence. And generations of Japanese citizens have grown up not knowing that their emperors were products of a reproductive system designed to treat women as disposable. This is how history is erased. Not with bonfires and book burnings, with silence, with omission, with the slow, patient work of not talking about something until no one remembers to ask. And the women? What happened to the women who were alive when the system ended? Most died in obscurity. They had no pensions, no public recognition, no monuments. Some lived long enough to see their biological children become emperors. They watched from a distance. They were not invited to coronations. Lady Yanagiwara Naruko is one we know something about. She was one of Emperor Meiji's consorts. She bore him a son who died in infancy. She bore him another son who survived. That son became Emperor Taisho. Naruko watched her son grow up calling another woman mother. She watched him ascend to the throne. She attended his coronation as a guest, not as family. She died in 1943. Her grave is in a Buddhist temple in Kyoto. The headstone does not mention she was the biological mother of an emperor. It does not mention she was an imperial consort. It says only her name and the date of her death. One line, one life, erased. This was not chaos. This was a system. And systems do not disappear when they end. They leave traces. They leave wounds. They leave questions that no one wants to answer. The question now is why? Why the secrecy? Why the erasure? What are they still hiding? The answer is darker than you expect. Power requires legitimacy. Legitimacy requires mythology. The Japanese imperial family is the oldest continuous hereditary monarchy in the world. Its lineage supposedly stretches back to 660 before the Common Era. That lineage is the foundation of the emperor's authority. It is sacred. It is unbroken. Except, it is not unbroken. It is threaded through with the lives of peasant women who were used and discarded. This is the secret they are hiding. Not the existence of court women. Everyone knows about imperial consorts if they care to learn. The secret is the implication. The implication that the divine bloodline is not purely divine. Shinto theology holds that the emperor is descended from Amaterasu, the sun goddess. This makes the emperor a living connection to the divine. But divine figures do not require consort systems to produce heirs. The consort system was a confession that the imperial family was human after all, that they needed the same biological processes as everyone else, that their bloodline was mixed with the blood of commoners. This was theologically embarrassing. It was politically dangerous. If the emperor was not divine, what was he? If his bloodline was not pure, why should anyone follow him? These questions were suppressed for centuries by raw power. The emperor ruled because he ruled. No one could safely ask why. But the Meiji Restoration changed the terms. Japan was modernizing. Japan was engaging with Western ideas. Western ideas included democracy. Western ideas included constitutional government. Western ideas included the radical notion that legitimacy came from the people, not from heaven. The Meiji reformers needed to thread a needle. They needed to modernize Japan without destroying the imperial institution. They needed to make the emperor compatible with the modern world. Their solution was elegant and dishonest. They made the emperor into a symbol of national unity, a symbol of cultural continuity, a symbol above politics, and symbols cannot have embarrassing histories. Symbols must be pure. So the court women were erased, not because their existence was unknown, because their existence was incompatible with the symbol the emperor had become. This is why the archives remain closed. This is why the textbooks remain silent. Because to acknowledge the imperial consorts is to acknowledge that the symbol was always a construction, that the mythology was always a story, that the divine bloodline was always a political project. This is not ancient history. This is present politics. The current Japanese constitution, written in 1947 under American occupation, stripped the emperor of political power. He is now entirely symbolic. But symbols still matter. Symbols still require protection, and the protection continues. The Imperial Household Agency still controls access to imperial archives. The government still declines to comment on imperial history. The wall of silence stands, but cracks have appeared. Scholars have published. Foreign archives have opened. The internet has spread information that would once have been contained. We now know more than any previous generation about what happened in those palace walls. We know about the ranking systems. We know about the punishments. We know about the children taken from their mothers. We know about the women who resisted. Some resisted through manipulation. They played factions against each other. They accumulated influence through their sons. The Fujiwara women were masters of this strategy. For centuries they dominated the court by placing their daughters as consorts and their sons as regents. They used the system to control the system. But they were nobles. They had resources. They had families. What about the peasant court women? What about the women with no allies? Some resisted through religion. They became Buddhist nuns after their service ended. They entered monasteries where they could not be recalled. This was not freedom. Monasteries had their own hierarchies, their own demands. But it was escape. It was refusal. It was saying no to a system that demanded endless compliance. Some resisted through withdrawal. The records are fragmentary, but they suggest elevated rates of women who simply faded away. Women who refused to eat. Women who stopped speaking. Women who retreated into themselves until nothing remained. We cannot know their reasons. We cannot presume their motives, but we can observe the pattern. And the pattern suggests despair. This was not passion. This was protocol. Protocol that drove women to abandon life rather than continue. And the court responded to these losses with studied indifference. A courtwoman who was gone was replaced. The machinery continued. Some resisted through sabotage, through whispered rumors, through strategic failures. A courtwoman who did not wish to conceive might take herbs that prevented pregnancy. These herbs were dangerous. They could cause permanent damage. But some women took them anyway, because the alternative was worse. A courtwoman who did not wish to serve might develop convenient illnesses, headaches, fevers, complaints that could not be disproven. These were small rebellions. They changed nothing in the larger system, but they mattered to the women who performed them. They were acts of agency in a world designed to eliminate agency. They were saying, in the only language available to them, this is wrong. And some resisted through witness, through recording what they saw. Lady Nijo wrote her diary. Sei Shonagon wrote her pillow book, a collection of observations about court life that includes devastating portraits of male cruelty. These women understood that truth was a weapon. That memory was resistance. They wrote knowing their words might be destroyed. They wrote anyway. That courage should not be forgotten. That courage is the only monument many of these women will ever receive. The system has ended. The women are all gone. The archives remain closed. But the questions remain open. What do we owe to people whose suffering was deliberately erased? What does acknowledgement look like when the victims are beyond helping? And what does it mean for a nation to build its identity on a lie? These are not comfortable questions. Japan has not answered them. But silence is not an answer. Silence is a continuation of the original wrong. And the final chapter of this story is about what happens when silence begins to break. The silence is cracking. Slowly. Painfully. In 2003, a Japanese scholar named Haga Noboru published a study of imperial court women. He used foreign archives, private collections, fragments. He faced opposition. Colleagues questioned his motives. Publishers hesitated. But the book was published. It named names. It gave dates. It documented what had been denied. The book did not become a bestseller. It was not adapted into a film. It did not spark a national conversation. But it existed. It added to the record. It made forgetting slightly harder. Other scholars have followed. Feminist historians in Japan and abroad have excavated the lives of court women. They have translated diaries. They have analyzed poetry for encoded messages. This work is slow. It is underfunded. It does not make headlines. But it matters. Every recovered name matters. Every documented experience matters. Because naming is the opposite of erasure. Naming is resistance. This was not brutality. This was protocol. And protocol can be documented. Protocol can be analyzed. Protocol can be condemned. The survivors of this system are all gone. There is no one alive who experienced the imperial consort system firsthand. But their descendants exist. Their communities exist. Their nation exists. And nations can choose to remember. Nations can choose to acknowledge. Japan has not made that choice. Not officially. The Imperial Household Agency has not apologized. The government has not established a memorial. The textbooks have not been revised. This is not unique to Japan. Many nations struggle to acknowledge historical wrongs. But the struggle is different when the wrong continues to benefit the present. When the mythology of the imperial family still serves political purposes. To acknowledge the court women is to acknowledge that the emperor is human, that his bloodline is mixed, that his authority was always constructed. Some would say, this does not matter. The emperor has no political power. He is purely symbolic. But symbols shape how people think. Symbols shape what people believe is natural and right. An emperor presented as divine legitimizes hierarchy. It legitimizes the idea that some people are inherently superior. An emperor presented as human, as the product of a system that used women, suggests something else. It suggests that power is always constructed, always contested, always requiring justification. That is a dangerous idea. Dangerous to those who benefit from hierarchy. So the silence continues, for now. But silence is not erasure, not completely. The women of the imperial court left traces, poems, diaries, children. Those traces cannot be completely eliminated. They exist in temple records and private collections. They exist in the bloodlines of living descendants. They exist in the gaps and evasions of official history. The places where the story does not quite make sense. Future generations will find those gaps. They will ask questions. They will demand answers. This is how history works. Not as a straight line from ignorance to knowledge. As a struggle. As a negotiation between those who want to remember and those who want to forget. The women of the imperial court lost that struggle in their lifetimes. They were silenced. They were erased. They were forgotten. But the struggle continues, and their cause can still prevail. This was not chaos. This was a system that lasted 1,000 years, a system that processed thousands of women, a system that shaped the bloodline of every Japanese emperor. To deny that system is to deny history. To minimize that system is to participate in the original wrong. The women deserve better. They deserve names. They deserve monuments. They deserve a place in the story of their own nation. They deserve what every human being deserves. To be remembered as they were. Not as symbols. Not as vessels. As people. People who suffered. People who endured. People who resisted in whatever ways they could. That is the truth that Japan has tried to bury. That is the chapter history tried to erase. Now you know. And knowing carries responsibility. Responsibility to remember. Responsibility to speak. Responsibility to refuse the comfort of ignorance. The silence is cracking. You can help break it. Share this story. Talk about it. Ask questions. Ask why the archives remain closed. Ask why the textbooks remain silent. Ask what else has been hidden. Because the court women are not the only buried story. Every nation has buried stories. Every institution has inconvenient truths. And the difference between a nation that grows and a nation that stagnates is the willingness to dig, to unearth, to confront. Japan is a nation of extraordinary achievements, extraordinary culture, extraordinary resilience, It is also a nation with shadows. Shadows that have not been examined. Shadows that continue to shape the present. The court women lived in those shadows. They lived their entire lives in those shadows. But shadows cannot survive light. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Because this is what we do here. We find the stories that were meant to stay hidden. We give voice to the people who were meant to stay silent. Tell me in the comments, what other buried histories should we unearth? What chapters has your nation tried to erase? The past is not dead. It is not even past. And the women of the imperial court are still waiting. Waiting to be named. Waiting to be known. Waiting for someone to say what should have been said centuries ago. You mattered. Your suffering mattered. And we will not let them forget.